This is the Constitution Committee of the House of Lords. We're conducting an inquiry into the future governance of the United Kingdom, and our witnesses this morning are Professor John Denham and Professor Michael Kenny. Welcome to you both. You've both written quite a lot about the England question, which is not a reference to last night's football. But you've both been quite vocal in your views. And I wondered if you could start this morning by giving us a very brief overview of where you're coming from on this issue. John Denham, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the chance of giving oral evidence. I mean, in brief, there are, I think, two problems. One is that within the Union at the moment, England is badly governed. So England, a nation of 55 million people, has no machinery of government. It is governed variously by government union departments, some of which are union-wide, some of which are England only, some of which are England and Wales. And that gives us no coherence to the government of England. Secondly, it's the most centralised nation in Europe, if you measure it, for example, by how much money is raised or spent at sub-national level. And thirdly, it obviously has no national expression of national democracy, which is a problem not just in formal democratic terms, but it means that unlike the other nations of the Union, there's nowhere where England can imagine itself or discuss its future as a 21st century nation. So one set of problems is that England ends up being badly governed. The second problem, which perhaps we'll come back to later, is that at the moment, England's government provides the union government that governs the union as though the union is the extension of England, right, rather than taking into account the views of the other nations. So the other side of the problem is that while on the one hand England itself is badly governed, a union government based almost entirely in England acts as though the interests of other nations are secondary.
Professor Kenny?
Thank you, Chair. Well, I would go a little bit further back, I suppose, to indicate my interest in this topic. I mean, for some while I've been working on questions about English identity and going really right back to the mid-1990s. The question of what were people hanging more on a sense of English identity, and I think there were different reasons why they were starting to do that. Then I think we move sort of about 10 years later into the mid-2000s, and you begin to see some political expressions of English identity, which I certainly think predate Brexit and more recent events. But Englishness, in a sense, becomes a force which has some political dimensions to it, as well as, I think, acquiring a certain cultural resonance for many people. Then I think those trends bump into the issues of governance that Professor Denham has just elaborated. And I think now one of the really interesting questions is, and really important questions for the future of the union itself, is how do the English feel about the union of which they are a part? And most of the emphasis in terms of the politics of the union is, of course, placed on developments in Scotland and what's happening in Northern Ireland with the protocol. But it seems to me that the somewhat neglected and absolutely crucial question here is what the English feel about the union, which in some ways they're only waking up to and beginning to engage with. And I think there's a very interesting question about how whether the English feel passionately involved, engaged with the union, or to some extent remain indifferent towards what happens in those other parts of the country.
Professor Kenny, you're saying in some respects it only just is beginning to get through in England, but you were saying it started in the early 90s, which is pre-devolution.
Yes, I think there's pretty clear evidence that actually feelings of Englishness as opposed to Britishness, because of course in England it's long been the case, and it still remains the case, that many people see the two identities as interchangeable. But I mean, you can see it, I mean, thinking of football, I mean, it was at Euro 96, at that football tournament, before devolution, that people began to pick up the flag of St. George and to wave it and to find meaning in those expressions of English identity. I think on the point about waking up, I think, looking back at the introduction of devolution, one of the really striking things now, I think, in hindsight, is the extent to which devolution was always framed as an issue for other parts of the country. The English were just not particularly engaged by their politicians in those debates, in those discussions. So I think for many people in England, I think devolution is still something that's poorly understood. Indeed, I suspect many people would have been quite surprised, if not shocked, by, in the context of COVID, by the realities of devolution in terms of the kinds of powers that different governments now hold.
Lord Sherburn, do you want to come in there?
Thank you, and good morning. I want to ask Professor Denham, really direct my question to him, because I read his submission to the committee with great interest, and he covers two areas in his report. One is the nature of the centralised government in England, which creates particular problems. But I want to focus my question on the other subject you raised, Professor Denham, which is the position of England in the current devolution settlement. And my question is this: so long as we have English votes for English laws, what are the practical, I emphasise the word practical, downsides, practical problems for England in the current devolution arrangements? What practical effects has it created for England?
Okay, I'd say, Lord Sherburn, a number of points. The first is that English votes for English laws does not create a voice for England or a national forum. And if one only has to look at the Hansard in the House of Commons to see that England as England is never discussed. And I think that's a real issue. I often find in my work on English identity, I get challenged, well, why is so much of English identity tied up with ideas of England in the past? And to some extent, that is because if you're not allowed to debate the future, as they do in other parts of the Union, you do get stuck with your symbols of the past. So EVEL doesn't provide that space for national debate. The second problem is that there is no government of England. So there's nobody sits down and says, how do the various policies of different parts of government create a politics and a policy for England? So if we took, for example, the Marmot report this morning on Greater Manchester health inequalities, that's a very good example of two things. It shows that we have a lack of joined up government in England that can deal with complex problems. And it also shows that the centralisation of England leaves somewhere like Greater Manchester without the resources and the powers devolved to local level to enable them to make progress on those issues. So centralisation has this double effect, that it means that we don't have really joined up policy for England as a nation. And secondly, we don't get devolution within England because there's actually no machinery of government to devolve it from. And you could also say, because the Prime Minister is effectively First Minister of England and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister never has a focus on England as a place of policy and political delivery because their attention is so much on the Union issues. So England suffers by neglect, I would say. And unfortunately, that's got worse in recent years, partly because the politics of this government are quite centralising, and that has enabled Whitehall to really seize power back and sort of say, yes, well, we actually think government is always best done from London by people who know what they're talking about. And we have to challenge that culture of the Union state as well.
Can I just come back? I can understand the point you make about the problems which arise from centralisation, and you have various proposals for dealing with that. But could that not be, those problems not be dealt with within the current devolution arrangements?
I think that I've looked at, for a long time, I looked at what happened when I was a government minister under the new Labour government with RDAs, and I've looked at the devolution deals that were brought in by the coalition government, which I think are now slipping out of favour. And the reality is that none of those successfully shifted power and resource out of Whitehall on the scale that was needed. And I think that that tells you something about failures at the centre of government. So yes, of course, Lord Sherburn, in principle, it might be possible under the current arrangements. It seems to me to be very unlikely to do that because there is no coherent machinery for government at the centre. So some reform at the centre is, I think, a precondition to the sort of devolution that England needs.
Lord Dunlop, bring you in at this stage.
Good morning. The historian Sir Tom Devine has argued that the Anglo-Scottish Union has been largely stable and successful for most of its 314-year existence, because England is dominant in terms of size and weight within the Union, but it's never sought, for the most part, to dominate. So my question is, do you agree with that assessment? And how strong do you think the dissatisfaction within England for the way it's governed, and how real is the risk going forward of England being more prepared to flex its muscles in the absence of changes to the way it's governed?
So there's a lot in that question, but if I could pick it apart a bit. The first is, I think that historically, for a large part of the period, Sir Tom Devine's observation is correct. But I think the idea that England could be subsumed within the Union began to become problematic as soon as the unitary state that was forged after the Second World War began to feel the strains of Scottish nationalism and of national aspirations in Scotland and Wales. And we've switched, if you like, from a position where you kept the Union going by not allowing England its own national identity to a situation where an England that dominates the Union by virtue of delivering a government that only wins elections in England is now the problem. So in other words, to keep the Union going now, we actually need to give England an expression, whereas it may well have been in truth in the past, you didn't need to do that or shouldn't do that. That's the first point. The second point is, I think, twofold about views in England. My own view is that the evidence suggests that people in England, and particularly those who emphasize their English identity, have really quite strong views about wanting, for example, English laws to be made entirely by English MPs. They tend to be more in favour of a parliament than against it. They want England's issues prioritised over those of the Union. These only occasionally come to bear in politics. They did undoubtedly in Brexit, and they've done that in recent elections. But there isn't a seething dissatisfaction, perhaps, about the way that England is governed at the moment. But there is a big dissatisfaction in the rest of the Union about the way in which an English-based unionist government is conducting itself. And so England's contribution to the current problem is that it is electing an Anglo-centric British nationalist government that is alienating other parts of the Union. And I might say, Sir Lord Dunlop, you captured some elements of that in the report that you produced recently. So the political expression of Englishness is certainly creating problems for the rest of the Union at the moment.
Professor Kenny, do you want to add to that?
Yes, if I may. I mean, 2 points. I agree with Professor Denham's account. One thing I would add to it, though, is I think there is dissatisfaction in parts of England with London-based government, if I can put it that way. And I think that is actually one of the strands that has been a driver for an upsurge of a sense of English identity. Actually, it's not the only one, but I think that's part of the story. And in one sense, in that sense, actually parts of England have become much more like other parts of the country in terms of their perception of how governance in the country works and the perception that government is too biased towards the interests of London and the South East region. That's one point. On the Anglo-Scottish Union, whilst I certainly wouldn't want to challenge Professor Devine's account of it, I'm sure he's right. I think it's important to see historically that there have been moments, recurrent moments of English anxiety, if not occasion of hostility, towards the view that Scotland has become too influential at the centre of government. And that's something you can see in the recent past, particularly in the New Labour period, but certainly has historical precursors. And I think that the West Lothian issue becomes the contemporary form that issue takes. I think there is real irritation with, in a sense of grievance, actually, when during I think it's the second term of the second Blair government's term, some controversial legislation is passed that only affects England because of the whipped vote of Scottish MPs. And I think that sense of mild irritation at the perception that the centre of government is too open to or too minded towards the interests of Scotland is something that has rumbled along. I agree with Professor Denham. This isn't a sort of raging hostility, but I think there's a sense of irritation and grievance there, which, connected to my first point, means that in certain parts of England, there is a really quite deep sense of discontent, I think, with the territorial, the sense of which are the interests that are being given most of a hearing by the centre of British government.
I'm going to bring Lord Dunlop back in a moment, but Lord Hennessy, I think you wanted to come in here.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you a two-parter question? The first one is a sort of Nye Bevan question. Remember, he famously denounced opinion pollsters as taking the poetry out of politics. Now, I know measuring the emotional geography, which is very, very hard to do at the best of times, is almost beyond the reach of even the most sophisticated pollsters. But Mike, you've looked at the history of all this. Do you think there's a benchmark or two you could help us with when, in England, we slipped into a position in many people's minds of either indifference or hostility towards the union, a good riddance one? Do you think there are crucial moments, or are we approaching that now? And then I'll follow up with the second question in a minute.
Professor Denham?
Oh, sorry, I thought that was to Professor...
All right, well,
can I just give a little anecdote?
Yeah.
Perhaps I can give an anecdote to measure the change. But I first met Lord Dunlop when we were both in different ways supporting Vosper Thornycross warship yard in Southampton in the 1980s to win orders. At that time, although there were national differences, this was very much seen as British warship yards competing for orders for the British Royal Navy. By the run-up to the referendum in Scotland, when all of the remaining warship work was taken away from the shipyards in the south to put them on the Clyde, that was absolutely seen by everybody in the Hampshire area as a political sop to Scotland to keep them in the Union. The idea of British shipyards and the British Royal Navy had gone out of the window. So if I can give you a sort of 20-year period, or perhaps 20-year period of time in which those attitudes changed, that's my anecdotal example, perhaps.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Professor Kenny.
Thank you. I'm delighted Professor Denham went first, so I could gather a better answer to that. I think there are different moments that I would want to pick out. I think in some ways, let me just very briefly mention three. I think the referendum in the Northeast in 2004, whilst that wasn't directly about the future of the UK or devolution, I think it was a very important moment when Labour presented its plans for a model of regional devolution, and against all the odds, it seemed that was voted down by those people who did turn out for that poll. And it seems to me that was an important moment because that was, I think, the beginning of a process we're more familiar with now, partly about Labour's fraying relationship with part of its working class base, but I think also that was about a perception that the sort of model of governance that worked in London, effectively, a vision of England as perhaps carved up into regions, was not one that had a kind of enjoyed popular support. I think that was important. I think also the 2015 general election, when you remember those images of Ed Miliband placed in Nicola Sturgeon's pocket, I think that reminded that that shot into that general election campaign just really brought home the extent to which, from some people in England, many people in England, a sense of a concern about the prospect of having a government that would be dependent upon, in this case, a nationalist Scottish party. It was very live. It was possible to bring that to the surface of politics. I think that was important. And my third moment is Brexit. I think it's quite clear, and polling has showed this since 2016, that for a large number of English Brexit supporting voters, delivering Brexit is a more important priority than necessarily, the what it may do to the UK Union. If that's a price that some people, quite a large number of people, are prepared to pay.
My final question is a Gladstonian one. Remember, he looked in the 1880s and talked about the need for home rule all round. Well, if we do a Mr. Gladstone this morning, what do we see? Dissatisfaction all round the entire kingdom for different reasons, of course. Do you think, both of you, that we've already separated in the mind as a kingdom?
I think we need to see ourselves as on the transition from a unitary state, the one that was created very largely after the Second World War, towards a union of nations. It seems to me that trying to reassert the union over the nations is not going to be possible politically. And so we need to reimagine ourselves and say there are very good reasons to maintain ourselves in union as a voluntary union of nations, or nations in Northern Ireland if you prefer. And we're an uncomfortable place within that at the moment, where the union has lost its power to be the decisive thing that defines us. But we have not yet had the imagination to see where that can take us. And I think that one of the things that worries me a lot at the moment is that the future of the union is defined by the task of persuading a majority of Scots not to vote for independence. That may be achievable, but if we end up with a situation where most Scots would like to leave, but a significant number don't think they can, where rising numbers of people in Wales, particularly young people, are intrigued by independence, where the community politics of Northern Ireland continue to play out post-Brexit, and where a good half of the people of England don't really care whether the union continues or not, this is not going to be a happy kingdom. And so we have to find a new basis to be together and a new sense of purpose which makes sense for the 21st century, not the 19th or 20th.
Professor Kenny.
I think it's important to remember that the union has always meant different things to the different parts of the country, and so I'm wary of attempting just a simple answer to your question, Lord Hennessy, because I just think what unionism means, what its roots are, what are the objects of its attachment are really quite different in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. That said, I wonder if actually the problem is more that the union of the heart is what has really declined here. I think people's sense of, a quite deep-rooted, sort of sentimental, almost unspoken attachment to the union, which certainly in my lifetime, I remember being a stronger force amongst my parents and their generation. I wonder if that's what's dissipated, and that what we're left with is a union that, in a sense, that has to be forged through the mind, has to be presented in a more, perhaps a more instrumental way, or discussed and presented rationally to people. And as we know, it's not as emotionally appealing to some people as is the lure of independent nationhood. But it seems to me that it's the depletion of those stocks of capital, emotional capital to the union, that's part of the problem here.
Lord Dunlop, shall we go back into your how that dovetails into your questions?
Well, I have a question about English votes for English laws, but perhaps I could slip in a supplementary to Professor Denham before that. You argue in your evidence that one of the aims of a reform is to constrain the ability of England or an English-based government to act on behalf of the union as a whole. So, could I ask you, what are the practical implications of that? And does it imply that union-wide policy can only proceed if all parts of the UK agree? And what happens if they don't all agree?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we need to understand we need a change from the winner takes all, first past the post culture of our politics. If you're going to have a devolved polity, then leadership depends crucially on respecting others within the system who have their own autonomy and their own legitimacy. And leadership becomes one of managing those relationships, not simply of saying the union government decides and that's it. So, of course, those tensions are there, and we're never going to get away from the fact that England is by far the largest and at the moment wealthiest part of the union and is likely to have more say than others. But I think there are things that we can do to bring those relationships, if you like, out into the open honestly. So in practical terms, I think that, obviously the Supreme Court came to a decision about the Sewell Convention, but I do think we need to find ways legally of guaranteeing the rights in their devolved areas of devolved administrations and indeed of England itself in my model. I would like to see a UK cabinet in which the nations are represented. So I think it's utterly anomalous at the moment that the Secretary of State for Education for England sits in the United Kingdom cabinet and tries to issue instructions to Scottish schools about which songs they should sing. But there's no representation of those who are responsible for education in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland in the Union government. So why don't we imagine a system in which the cabinet actually only has people in it who have union-wide responsibilities, plus the first ministers of the nations, to actually imagine operating government as though the different parts of it work. Now, will that resolve the tensions you raise? No. Does it give us a better chance of resolving those tensions and working out the best way forward? Then I'm sure that it does.
Thank you for that. And I'm sure others will want to pursue that further. But I mean, coming to English votes for English laws, I mean, obviously there was a report in the Times recently that the government plans to revoke the EVEL procedures in the House of Commons. So could I ask both of you, what do you make of this development? And do you think there are ways of improving the working of EVEL as an alternative to revocation?
I'm going to suggest Professor Kenny goes first, because he's done all of the really serious academic work about EVEL. And then I'll make some more political comments, if I may.
Thanks, John. Can I just very briefly go back to the question you asked Professor Denham, Lord Dunlop, just on the question about, is disagreement going to be with us? Is it possible to manage the UK and imagine a system where there isn't disagreement? Of course not. But I do think that also points to one of the structural problems or institutional weaknesses of our model of devolution, which is that we've not really attended seriously to building a machinery to bring the different governments and heads of government together. And as you know, that's a much more typical feature of other systems which have various kinds of decentralisation within them. And it does seem to me that some of the very public rows that we've had in both in relation to Brexit and COVID might to a degree have been mitigated or handled differently had such a machinery been in use and a culture of partnership working built across it. But let me turn to EVEL. I think it's. I was somewhat surprised to see that report, and it does appear the government is looking seriously at revoking EVEL. I mean, I think it's the surprise is that this is a Conservative government, and it was a fairly recent Conservative predecessor government that introduced EVEL, in part because it thought that the West Lothian question needed to be answered. One of the sort of structural overhangs of the model of devolution we have. So I think the current government, at the very least, needs to explain why it thinks the West Lothian question no longer needs to be answered in this particular way. I think if the underlying motivation is that, well, this is a potential irritation to Scottish nationalists, this may be a way of winning some people back to the union cause. That's a surprising view, because EVEL has, as you know, very little salience anywhere in the UK and has really only been raised as an issue by a handful of SNP MPs. If there is a different view, which I suspect is the underlying motivation, that this is a way of rather symbolically indicating the government's disquiet with the principle of legislative consent, which of course is expressed through the Sewell Convention in relation to devolved governments. And EVEL was set up in part to mimic that process. It does it imperfectly, but it is a sort of simulacrum of legislative consent. I suspect that's the motivation. Then it seems to me that is really quite a major step to take. And I think the government would be well advised to, at the very least, look hard at how EVEL has operated. As Professor Denham says, I've done quite a lot of work looking at its operation, particularly in its first 2 years. And whilst it's certainly true that EVEL is very complicated, it's not loved by many MPs at all, it has succeeded in the sense of it hasn't been a problem. It hasn't really got in the way of legislative outcomes. And of course, it is there to potentially address what could be an existential issue in British politics. But if we do have a government which does not carry the support of the majority of MPs in England and does try to legislate on English matters. So I think it would be very helpful at this point to hear more about the government's reasoning and to be reassured that they are committed to evaluating how EVEL is operated.
Professor Denham, you wanted to add a few words.
Well, I mean, I think in the short term it has little practical impact because EVEL has not made much difference to Parliament. It's not given England a voice. It does, as Professor Kenny says, make it much easier for a non-conservative, non-English majority government to govern, although possibly not that easy. I think the symbolic importance and political importance is great. I think it is a very clear sign that this is an Anglo-centric British nationalist government that actually wants to assert the unitary state. And within that, the idea of a separate political representation of England makes no sense. It does potentially open up a debate about England, a wider debate than we have been having, because if the government is taking us in the direction of saying we don't want any representation or manifestation of England within the constitution of the Union, it opens it up possibly to others to take a different view. And the interesting thing, mention was made of opinion polls, the one change to the constitution that has always had a majority of support in every single opinion poll for 20 years has been the idea that non-English MPs should be excluded from making English legislation. And so, for example, if we say, how do we take things forward differently? I have long been a supporter of a dual mandate Westminster. I mean, there's a bit of me would like to wake up tomorrow with an English Parliament, and there are many practical reasons why going there in one fell swoop is impossible. But a dual mandate Westminster in which English MPs sat on occasion to determine English legislation and to discuss English affairs would be in tune with English public opinion and would not ruin the constitution of the Union. And that is what I would, if I was going forward from EVEL backwards, that's what I'd be proposing.
Lord Dunlop, do you want to come?
Just a very quick supplementary. I mean, do you think the fact that EVEL hasn't created that voice for England, is that really a matter of political choice rather than the structure of EVEL? Because you have England-only MPs committee stage, and you have the Legislative Grand Committee. The fact that particularly that latter stage hasn't been used to have a debate about England-only issues, I mean, that isn't to do with the structure. That's a choice that has been made.
In part, that's true. I accept that. And in part, that reflects the fact that the culture in Westminster is somewhat out of step with the English public. I mean, if I look at political party that I represented in Parliament, the Labour Party, will always talk about Britain when it means England. And so there's very little political culture of addressing England as England, even though millions of people in England talk about England as a natural part of their everyday life and their conversation. So yes, to some extent, but a lot of this, of course, happens with the interaction of constitutional structures with political cultures is what makes constitutions behave the way they do. So in a sense, EVEL, had it been set up as a dual mandate Westminster, would have had a bigger impact on the way that England is discussed than the procedures that we have at the moment.
But don't you think that people do think of themselves as British?
Well, what we have in England is the largest single group of people think of themselves as equally English and British. And then you have these days round about a quarter who think they're more English than British and about a quarter who think they're more British than English. So actually, the truth is that 4 out of 5 people in England do think they are English. So Britishness is not the dominant identity in England. It may be very slowly getting there as a younger generation grows up that is more British than English, but amongst the voting public, there's more Englishness out there than Britishness. And to the extent that sort of liberal cosmopolitan Britishness is quite different to the Britishness of the Englishness and Britishness, which is very English in its characteristics, I think we could say England is a country that is significantly more English than British at the current time. How that will evolve in the future, we will have to see, but that's where we are at the moment. So I think to think that we can use Britishness both to talk about England as a place that has its own health policy, its own higher education policy, its own social care policy, and Britishness as the Union, and Britishness as Britain, the island of Britain, is a great confusion which doesn't help us, I think. So we do need to talk about England as England.
Lord Howell, I think you want to come in.
Well, yes, I must say, I understand a lot of your analysis, and I totally agree that there's an obvious need for a better union. I know that begs a lot of questions, but what you say about England, what you're saying to Lord Dunlop does, I confess, worry me a lot. I mean, is the proposition that England's place within the Union should be explicitly and legally recognised in government and obviously in Parliament? If so, doesn't that do the opposite of what we're all trying to achieve? It emphasises more vividly than ever before the disproportionate size of England vis-a-vis its two very, very much smaller but lively neighbours, two nations on the island of Britain. And doesn't it go right against the basic fact that we are in a melting pot, and we have been for 300 years? And your analysis of the difference between English and Britishness, I don't think stands up to any 5-minute visit in a chat in the streets. That a lot of people, millions of families, have somebody of Scottish connection or Welsh connection or Irish connection. And this has been the mood which has managed to shape Britain for the last 300 years and enable this disproportionate factor somehow to be balanced out. So I'm left wondering whether you really realise where your ideas are going to lead. One's left with the frame, what do they know of England that only England know?
If that's some very challenging questions, but I could try to take them in turn. I believe that the way in which England is subsumed within the Union government is now the problem for the Union, not the solution. Whatever may have been the case in the past, once you get a government, as we do at the moment, which doesn't win a majority of seats in any part of the Union other than in England, which then chooses to have a very English view of the interests of the Union, as was manifest in the way that Brexit has been implemented, the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Internal Markets Bill, then what you see is the dominance of England expressed in the name of the Union. And that you could argue that that was the case in the 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher's government, which was an English government. The difference then is you had British politics, that there was no separate representation of Wales and Scotland, and Labour was strong in Wales and Scotland, and Labour looked as though it could win in England and form an alternative union government, which is what happened. Since devolution, British politics has died. The British politics, in the sense that politics is really the same two major parties fighting with varying success in England, Wales and Scotland, hasn't been the case for 3 general elections. Different parties have won the majority in each nation in the last 3 general elections, and without being too pessimistic from my partisan point of view, I don't see that changing in the very short term. So now the problem is England's size is because it dominates the Union. And so delineating England, I think, is the single most important reform to save the Union. In terms of Englishness, I mean, you can argue this, and I do in part, about identity, but my paper doesn't really talk very much about English identity. That's come up in this discussion, because I also think there's a practical democratic issue. England now has no government but separate policy. Up until 1997, England was part of the same unitary state and probably didn't suffer too much from it in terms of getting its way. Now it has a separate health policy, separate education policy, you name it, but no government and no system of national democracy. And that is an untenable situation. So I would argue the case for England, at least as much as a civic and democratic case, but also to pick up your very important point about identity. Because there is no forum at which the future of England is discussed, we don't resolve these issues. Indeed, there's a danger at the moment of a polarization in England between those who are more British than English, who represent one set of values and one set of demographics and one set of cities, and those people who are more English than British, who are in other places, who are different demographics. So enabling England to imagine itself for the future is, I think, critical to all of this. So I entirely understand the points you're making, but I have reached the opposite conclusion about how we take things forward. And actually, the England problem is now best resolved by bringing it out into the open, not hiding it within the Union.
Professor Kenny?
Yes, I think devolution really changed a lot of things. And I think it's very important to have that to the forefront of our minds in thinking about this. And partly this is a question about, from a unionist perspective, where does jeopardy lie here? Does it lie in giving some acknowledgement or some form of recognition to, in this case, England, the largest part of the UK, or does it lie in denying that, in carrying on, continuing a tradition, which has been a venerable tradition, which rests heavily upon what I would call the elastic of English tolerance, which connects, I think, to the point that Professor Devine has made about the Anglo-Scottish Union. I think that elastic has frayed considerably for different reasons in the last 20 years. And I think it now would be potentially very risky from a unionist perspective to assume that that the English are prepared to think about the union, think about devolution as only being something for other people in the way that perhaps they once were. I think then more generally as well, in terms of English sentiment, I think it is important to see that there are some important shifts underway at the popular level. How English people think about their own nationhood does seem to me to have changed in quite important ways. I don't myself subscribe to the idea that there's an English nationalism afoot, which is about to sort of break the union apart. But I do think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that many people in England are of the view that England ought to be given more than just cultural recognition, that there ought to be some kind of protection for English interests, which is what EVEL was trying to address. And perhaps more than that, some sort of recognition so that a kind of catch up with the realities of post-evolved governance, which is what Professor Denham has been describing. And I think it doesn't seem to me that the English are champing at the bit to break the UK up at all, but I think they are becoming more engaged with the realities of the union as it is currently constituted, perhaps more dissatisfied with some of the things that they find. And it seems to me the direction of travel, which we were moving in prior to the last government, was that actually we would try to manage that process of giving a degree of protection and recognition without upsetting the whole apple cart, if you like. And if the current government is set on reversing that course, then I think it needs to consider carefully exactly what the implications of that might be, given it would really put it at some distance from, I think, where English opinion lies.
You see, I don't think it is like that. I don't think this difference between past and present governments is quite as you describe. I mean, Professor Denham, you've been in a cabinet and so have I in the distant past, and you'll remember that we spent a lot of time, as did our departments, worrying about what was happening in Wales and Scotland and having to aim off from the sort of narrow desires of the English to do for what the English wanted. I just feel you're confusing the grievance culture, which of course has always been there and has been vastly amplified in the digital age by the cell telephone, the iPad and all the rest, and the internet. You're giving that a sort of huge political prominence, which it doesn't quite deserve. These are problems that have to be dealt with. Grievances have to be addressed sensibly, but that doesn't mean we should start redefining and breaking up into fragments the explicit national sentiments which you want to do. That's a worry that must be in most people's minds when they hear what you've got to say.
I think, if I may, Lord Howell, that our different cabinet experiences are captured at different moments in time. And I think in the Conservative governments of the 1980s and early 1990s, what you say probably is true. And that as a union government, and you were there and you would know it took into account those sensitivities. I think I can reasonably say that I was in government at a period of time where, I don't know whether Lord Dunlop invented the phrase devolve and forget, but the practice of devolve and forget became quite a sort of dominant feature of government. And of course, it tended to happen certainly in the early years of the Labour government, because Labour was in power in Scotland and Wales. And so things could be sorted out through party relationships, not formal constitutional relationships. But once you get back into a position where you do have a very powerful union government whose majority depends entirely on England, and the representation of Wales and Scotland is of different political parties, I think the dynamics are very, very different indeed. And some things can be done better to improve the machinery of government and liaison. They can be done much better. But I don't myself think that those will be sufficient to get us out of the problem that we're in at the moment. And it seems to me that the status quo is a threat to the union. And so if my proposals sound radical, it's as much as anything a belief that staying where we are means we will end up losing the union.
Baroness Sooty, you want to follow up there, perhaps?
Yes, thank you very much. A specific question really for Professor Denham. Do you think there is public support and indeed support from MPs for what you are suggesting? And the question really to both of you is that, do you not think that there is a danger that although there's clarity on the problem, there is a lack of clarity on the solution to these issues?
Let me put one big caveat, that there is very little public debate about these issues in English politics. Unlike Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland, where issues of the constitution and identity are a staple of daily discussion, these things are not discussed. So we have to be cautious about saying what the public want. What we do know for 20 years is that a majority of people in England, not just the people who feel English, want English laws made by MPs who come from England. So a step in that direction would be popular, and indeed the polling when David Cameron first proposed EVEL showed huge public backing for that particular reform. I think that issues like a more coherent machinery of government for England, particularly if that leads to devolution within England, as it should, would be with a grain of public sentiment. You asked a separate question, which is, are the MPs in tune with public opinion on these issues? No, generally speaking, is my experience that most MPs from England have traditionally been very wary of getting into this territory. That largely, I think, for reasons that Lord Howell summed up very well, a fear that this was opening a can of worms that might make things worse rather than better. But I think as the tensions in the union have unfolded, the need to make change becomes much more apparent than perhaps it did 10 years ago.
Professor Kenny.
Yes, on the question about is there a lack of clarity about solutions, I think absolutely. And I mean, I would echo the point about the absence really of a sustained conversation in England with English people about these sorts of issues. I think that's been a very marked feature of how we've conducted our constitutional life, and that potentially now is something that's coming back to haunt us. I think on solutions, part of the problem here is I think that some of the solutions that have been proposed are what I would call very big bang solutions. You'll hear people talk about let's have a federal model, let's have a very radical remake of the UK system. And I think that's fine. I mean, I think we should be debating different kinds of solutions. It seems to me it is incumbent on those people to show us how we might get there. And also, it does seem to me that there's a lot of sort of talk about that kind of solution without really addressing the really major challenges that lie, or the obstacles that lie between where we are now and getting to that point, and not least the fact that I remain very unconvinced that at the level of public opinion in England, there is a real appetite for turning the UK into that kind of federal system. So I think the problem is we need therefore, I think to think about solutions in quite practical terms. I think there are some changes. We talked about machinery of government. I think there are changes around culture, which do pick up on Lord Howe's point, because it does seem to me that the question of whether at British government we have enough of an all-round perspective on the UK, and there are enough connections between Whitehall, Westminster, and the different experiences and outlooks of people in different parts of the country. That too is a huge challenge that we ought to be thinking about. So I tend to be of the view that we ought to understand the problem a bit more deeply before we reach for solutions.
Did you wish to come back, Baroness? No, fine. Okay, in that case, let's move on to Baroness Drake.
Apologies, I didn't think you were getting to me so quickly. Yes, distinguishing between the causes and the symptoms of discontent can be quite problematic when you're looking for efficient solutions. For example, it could be argued that the view amongst some people that devolution has disadvantaged England could be a symptom of a deeper underlying problem, such as the regional inequalities in access to financial resources, economic activity, and power, which of course are not caused by and in fact predate devolution, but devolution becomes a hook upon which there's a stronger articulation of that discontent. But both of you are very strongly arguing that the solution must include quite a heavyweight delineation of England within the Constitution. So my question is, to what extent does explicitly recognising England's place within the Union, or in not so recognising, create or heighten the risks to the future of the Union?
My view is the risk of not doing it is that a government rooted in England continues to act as though it speaks for the Union as a whole. At the same time, England remains with a very poor system of centralised government, with limited or non-existent democracy and a bad machinery of government. So delineating England is the way both of restraining English pretensions to say we speak for the Union, and the same way of getting the best government for England. And so I think that it's actually really crucial to do this. I think that we do it in step by step. I don't believe in big bang reform, but I think there are things that you can do over a period of time to improve England's machinery of government, to delineate English affairs more clearly within Westminster, and to include better representation for all of the Union within a Union cabinet, for example, as I propose in my paper. So yes, I am proposing a radical vision of where we go to in the future, but possibly a rather what I call strategic incrementalism in the way we actually approach doing it. And we make reforms and then we let them bed in, and then we see what, if anything, needs to be done next.
Professor Kenny.
I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there are different problems at stake here, and if we're trying to understand the source of the causes of English discontent, we should look in various directions. And I do agree with you that one of them would be around the very entrenched issue of regional inequalities. I think the problem is, though, that those people's feelings about those have become muddled up with or intertwined with their feelings about governance and where power lies within the country to which they belong. And I think you can see that, this is an issue that's going to, in some shape or form, come to the surface around the government's levelling up agenda, because the question of whether you can deliver a very ambitious sounding programme like that without some sort of delivery architecture that involves local partners and perhaps some sort of devolved system is going to be a very live policy question. They're bound to hit that question however they answer it. And it seems to me that's where we're at with this, is that it's very hard now to separate these things out and say we'll just treat this as an issue of regional inequality, not least because dealing with regional inequality is itself so difficult. So I think governance has become part of the story. I do agree with you that it's of course not the case that all the causes of England's discontent are constitutional in character. The second point is that rather than, I'm not sure heavyweight delineation is what I'm proposing. What I am proposing is that I think it's very important that we look much harder at what I think is the problem now of English consent, and that we no longer just take it as a given that the English are comfortable with the model of the devolved union that we've reached. Now, what the answer to that is, what the English actually want, I think we're not at a position to answer, because for the reasons I gave earlier, that we haven't had that kind of sustained conversation or debate. And I'm urging actually that we think harder about it and take a bit of time. But I think, here I am with Professor Denham, I think if we sort of pretend that the problem of consent is not a major issue in our politics, I suspect that is a road to greater jeopardy in the management of the union.
Baroness Drake, did you want to come back at all?
Yes, if I could come back, particularly to Professor Denham. This issue of English interests being seen as dictating union interests. If you delineate an English cabinet and an English parliament, and you are in a country where the ratio of the English to the Scottish population is 10 to 1, if you do that, when dealing with cross-union issues, why would that stop the geographic and numerical dominance of England still influencing unionist policies? How do you know it will produce that outcome? It may increase that outcome because you've so strengthened the English identity that it becomes more assertive on unionist issues, across union issues.
I think my view is this. I mean, well, when Kilbrandon opposed the idea of sort of delineating England in the early 1970s, he said the constitution would be so unwieldy as to be unworkable. However, I think that's a pretty good description of where we are at the moment with the current constitution, because we have at the moment a government that has a majority of over 150 in England, but only a majority of under 90 in the United Kingdom. It is a government rooted only in England. And it insists repeatedly that its English view of what is in the interests of the Union predominates despite the views of Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Protocol could only have been negotiated by an Anglo-centric British national government that put England's interests in Brexit ahead of those of the Union. The Internal Market Bill could only have been introduced by a government that said that what England wants out of the return of powers from Brussels is what the Union must have. So England's size is dominating the Union to the detriment of the Union at the moment. My view is that actually enabling England to have its own national identity or national representation, sorry, not national identity, national democratic representation, for example, on all of those issues where England already has separate policy. So the Union government no longer sets English higher education fees, structures, because why should it? Why are university fees set by the Union government when they're set by the Welsh government and the Scottish government? So simply allowing England to have its own domestic policy would be a step forward. Now, you can't do anything about England's size. The judgment, and this is my judgment, I'll be honest about it, is that bringing England's size out into the open and developing much more formal rules of, if you like, engagement and in relationship between England, the other nations, and the Union will make these problems easier to resolve rather than harder. This is a reversal of the received wisdom, if you like, of people who've looked at the Constitution over the years. But that is because of this accumulation, the end of British politics, the effects of devolution, the fact that we have separate policy regimes, now means we need to address these things in a different way.
Lord Howarth.
I'd like to ask you to explore a bit further a line of thought that Professor Kenny began to develop a few minutes ago. I think we all accept that there's a crisis across Britain of disaffection from Westminster and Whitehall, and that the Union, the future of the Union, is at risk. But Professor Denham, you're proposing
radical, large-scale institutional reform. And I just wonder how feasible it's going to be to achieve this, even in a step-by-step approach. And if we look at attempts to achieve quite minor, relatively minor constitutional reforms, electoral reform or reform of the House of Lords, we see that they run into the sand. And how much more likely is that if you have a grand blueprint for a new constitution? So should we not perhaps be looking for a solution that is attitudinal rather than institutional? I mean, if the problem is greedy centralization driven by the Treasury, which is a department possessed by control freakery, and by an ungenerous, self-aggrandizing House of Commons, which is disrespectful of local government and jealous of any power that may be devolved to the nations and regions, shouldn't the solution be for Whitehall and Westminster to let go and somehow to persuade them to do so, to allow local autonomy to flourish? The forms of local democracy would be less important than a new willingness to allow autonomy. Or has the loss of belief in the union of the heart, as Professor Kenny called it, gone so far that it's beyond being retrieved by an improvement in attitudes?
Who wants to go first?
I'll have a go first. Firstly,
you go first.
I'm not proposing a big constitutional blueprint precisely for that reason. I was in the House of Commons for 23 years, and all of that time, everybody agreed that a majority of the House of Lords should be elected, and it was never achieved. So even one simple thing that most people agreed on couldn't be achieved. I do think you can take these incremental steps. So you could reform Westminster procedures. You could reform the civil service to create a machinery of government for England. You could have a Secretary of State, a powerful figure who actually coordinated that work. So I think these are more achievable, but I very much think you take it in stages. I'd say two things on attitudes. Absolutely, we need political leadership that has a 21st century reason for there being a union. We can't have a union because we've got an empire. And we're not going back to the sort of union we had after the Second World War, when the Attlee government created a centralised unitary state. So there has to be a 21st century reason. And that seems to me to be the political leadership that says there are things like zero carbon transition, a post-Brexit economy, social inclusion, that we can actually achieve better as four parts working together than as a single one. So yes, without a vision as to why we should have a union, the union can't be saved by any type of constitution and it will fall apart. But do we need some changes that go along with that? Yes. The third part of the question is really, why just don't we do devolution within England? I'm afraid the conclusion that I have reached is that both Westminster and Whitehall are so wedded to the power that comes with centralisation and to the belief in the superiority of centralised policy making, that without shaking the system up, you won't get devolution within England. I mean, every time Whitehall does devolution, they invent a system for getting local areas to do what Whitehall wants them to do. And that was the same in the Labour government through RDAs, and it's been the same with the Conservative government through devolution deals. So I do think the radical direction of travel I want to go in is integral to making devolution in England happen, because it's been talked about for so long. There have to be reasons why it hasn't.
Professor Kenny.
Yes, on the first point you raised, Lord Howth, about the constitutional process, I suppose, type issues. I mean, I do think that there's a more general issue there that you'll be well aware of. That one of the challenges we face in our system, and this is not necessarily a territorial issue, but it's just about the absence of an agreement about how we do constitutional change, which of course in one sense is a feature of the British model of parliamentary government, that we do it incrementally, and we tend to do it when there's a majority of MPs in the House of Commons lined up behind a change. And even then, as Professor Denham says, it doesn't always come out the other end of the pipeline. I worry in the current moment, particularly over these voting rules of the House of Commons, that if we move into a situation where the government of the day decides on the basis of contingent political factors that it should change those rules because they don't seem to be having much of an effect and so on. If those rules touch on important points of principle, which I think we would all agree they do, then we probably want, I think, a more rigorous and to a degree impartial process to consider when we should change those kind of rules. Because if the current government, for instance, changes the rules on EVEL, which it can do just through a single vote of members of the House, then of course the future government may decide it will change those laws or reintroduce them. And we enter, I think, rather dangerous territory in that particular issue. On your second point about, is in a sense the answer here to have more localism and more local devolution, I think it's I mean, undoubtedly there are a very, very important set of questions there in their own right. It's interesting just to go to the realm of public opinion, go back to opinion polls, which can be overused, I agree, but it does look as if whilst this discontent that we've identified is very real in parts of England, there isn't an overwhelming demand amongst the public at large for devolved government. I mean, that doesn't look as if there's a sort of hugely enthusiastic mandate. There's some evidence that where devolved middle layer government's been introduced, as for instance in Greater Manchester, that people gradually become more used to it and grow into liking it. And so it may be that we need to think about public attitudes in that way. But the trends that we're talking about here at the level of national perception, the perception of England's interests, are much stronger in the polling, whatever one makes of that. So there's a question here, I think, about establishing a popular mandate for the kinds of reforms we wish to undertake. Then there's a separate question about how we do localism, because there are lots of questions there, as you will know, about what's the appropriate geographical scale to which we devolve and what's the right form that devolution should take.
Yeah, well, we come on to that in a moment, I think. Moving on a little, but coming back to some of those issues, Baroness Drake, you had a point you wanted to bring in there.
Yes, can I ask you if you believe that more significant reforms to the UK's territorial constitution is desirable, such as federalism or the proposed Act of Union?
An Act of Union. Professor Denham?
Okay, I've been involved a bit with the Constitution Reform Group, and I think they have done a very useful job in setting out in a legal form what a new constitution might look like. However, I am really sceptical about the possibility of there being a single constitutional moment where we come forward and we look at all of these questions about parliaments, UK government, fiscal solidarity, the rights of nations, electoral systems, and all the rest of it, and everybody agrees a new document which is the way forward. That just seems to me to be, it's the sort of thing that only happens usually if a country's either had a revolution or been invaded by somebody else and who sets up a new constitution. So I think we need to think of this differently. And what I've tried to argue in my evidence is if we think of the union in the future as this union of nations that come together by consent because of what they can achieve together, then we should take incremental steps that move us in that direction. So I've set out some of those for England. I've set out some of the things you could do about the way the UK cabinet operates. I've set out clearly there is a need to formalise more the relationships between the nations and the union government because of the uncertainties now about the Sewell Convention. And this means a serious legal debate about the relationship between the Supreme Court and the things we're talking about. I think we're better to take a few steps and then a few steps and then a few steps, but always having it in mind that what we're trying to preserve is not a union state which that sits on top of and governs the nation, but moving towards a vision of a union of nations. And if we can keep that vision in mind, then we can take lots of sensible steps along the way, which over time rewrite the constitution, but perhaps in keeping with our tradition of doing it bit by bit. And then we begin to see the acts of devolution at the end of 1990s as part of a process of change. And indeed, both of those have changed beyond recognition. since the initial Labour legislation through subsequent legislation. So we're used to this idea of incremental change, but we've tended to do it without a sense of direction. We've tended to do it each time saying, well, this will solve it, and now they'll shut up and they will go away. We need to bring a sense of ultimate vision of where we want to be and how that would be different to the union that we had, 2 decades ago, 2 generations ago.
Professor Kenny.
I mean, two problems, it seems to me, stand in the way of the federal vision, or at least 2 problems, really. But one is the size of England, which we've referenced previously. I mean, that just structurally makes a federal model extremely difficult to realise. And there are very few. There's been an attempt to sort of look through the history books and find parallel such a model, and I'm not convinced by any of those that have been advanced. So that makes it a very structurally difficult option to take, even if we got through, managed to sort of generate the kind of consent which as Professor Denham says is perhaps unlikely. I think the second problem, which is easy to overlook, and this is something I think that crops up in the context of the Act of Union, is the issue of parliamentary sovereignty, which is of course sort of hardwired into our constitutional tradition and the way in which our institutions of government and parliamentary government operate. The Act of Union, which is a very interesting initiative, but does, I think, still make the assumption that parliamentary sovereignty will still be in operation, which seems to me to sit in some tension with the idea that we are then moving towards a model of self-governing nations. So that we need to work through that. And I think more generally, that just points to the extent to which parliamentary sovereignty remains an absolute central feature of our system, and we would need to move in those directions to be making some very important choices about whether we wish to abridge or indeed even replace that principle. And this, it seems to me, also goes back to the question of the model of devolution that was introduced by the new Labour governments at the millennium. I mean, it seems to me one of the most artful and fateful aspects of those reforms was the sense of whether this really changed the nature of sovereignty within the country legally and politically, what was completely put to one side. There was a sort of pretense that things would carry on as before, when, of course, a very different perspective on the nature of sovereignty has come to reside, sits within the different devolved governments. And there have always been different perspectives on sovereignty within British politics and within different parts of the UK. But it seems to me it's no longer sustainable to pretend that we can have those different perspectives being institutionalized within our system of government. So I think we need to start by thinking very hard and having a conversation about parliamentary sovereignty.
Baroness Drake, did you want to come back at all there?
Yes, please, just briefly. I think just summarising, any of my friends who are politicians would, I think, agree with many of the points that you've made, both in your written evidence and today. I regularly speak to large numbers of people from a range of backgrounds, local groups, charities, and I must say the only time I've ever known any of them even think about the question of Englishness is when there's major football fixtures. So I'm really interested in finding out where all these people are who are so concerned about better representation for England, because other than politicians, and I don't mean this, to detract from anything you say, and of course I totally accept that you are the experts, but why have I just not met with any of them, despite the fact that I really do have a lot of involvement with a lot of groups?
Professor Denham.
I think in part, because I recognise what you say, it is because there is a set of attitudes towards national interests, sovereignty and democracy that are strongly associated with ideas of England. But these are rarely articulated as Englishness in politics. I mean, if I could give you an example of those people who say they're more English than British, 70% voted Leave. Of those people who are more British than English, 70% voted Remain. Nobody who campaigned in the referendum on either side came across somebody who's saying, I'm leaving because it's the English thing to do, or I'm remaining because it's British. But the ideas of sovereignty, of what should be decided by the nation, rather than within the European Union were incredibly compelling and powerful. And there's been an even more significant alignment of that sense of identity behind the current government and the basis of its 2019 election victory. So we are in this odd position, which I entirely recognise, that these things are rarely articulated as a sort of in-your-face thing, but they express a really deeply held sense of who people are. And Professor Kenny earlier said there's many layers to this. So in part, it can be resentment that prescription charges aren't free, or that higher education fees are more. In part, it's a sense that we come from places that feel English, that have been marginalised in politics for a long period of time. In part, and there's no denying this, the people who are more English have been more concerned and perturbed by the impact of immigration over the past 20 years. So all of these things come together. Now, what that means is, I think, that if we make these changes, we can't simply assume that people put all the flags out, St George's flags or whatever, and say, hey, we've got what we wanted. Professor Kenny's made the point that as we make institutional changes, we have to build support for them. As in Wales, for example, where support for the Welsh Senate is much stronger today than support for the Welsh Assembly was at the time of the Welsh referendum. I think we can be confident, though, that making these changes would lead to better governance that people would recognise in their everyday lives. And that ultimately is the most important thing.
Baroness Corston, you wanted to ask a question about sovereignty, but you may feel that your points have been answered. Do you want to follow up in any way? Sorry, you're on mute.
Professor Kenny has certainly answered some of my question, but Professor Denham hasn't. So I will ask Professor Denham, does England's size and the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty create impediments to reform?
Yes, I think ultimately we need to imagine this as a union of nations, which suggests that sovereignty cannot rest solely in one place. I do believe that. I think actually we started on that journey with devolution. And I think there is a different concept of sovereignty politically in Scotland, and some would argue in Scots law, about sovereignty lying with the people, not with the sovereign in Parliament, as it is in Dicey and our constitutional traditions. The only point at which I might disagree respectfully with Professor Kenny is maybe we shouldn't start from this question. Maybe the principle of parliamentary sovereignty may be lying around long after in practice it has disappeared. In other words, you don't start with formally having a vote to get rid of parliamentary sovereignty. But every time you devolve power and you give people power as of right to exercise in a way that is not overruled by Westminster, you've changed the nature of parliamentary sovereignty. But I think the idea of insisting on parliamentary sovereignty over the rest of the Union in the way that is now being done and may have existed in the past is a real problem.
I think that leads into Lord Hope, actually.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I wonder actually whether the principle that no parliament can bind its successor has a part to play in this too, because whatever reforms you put in place are at risk of being undone by another parliament with possibly a different political agenda. But the point I'd like to pursue with both of you is Professor Denham's idea of incremental steps, because I can see that you can begin with the idea of delineating England. But very shortly, as you're taking your steps along the road, you're going to come up against the problem of regional differences. And I wonder how really you can tackle that without getting into the question, which has been at least partly solved in Scotland, of the money, where the money comes from, because policies have to be expressed by the spending of money. In Scotland, we have our own rate of taxation and we have our own budget. And it's all very visible to us. I live in Scotland. But is your incremental step going that far along the line? The idea of an English budget for English matters and possibly a rate of taxation for England, which would be different from the rate in Wales and so on.
I think this is one of the areas where I will be honest and say I'm not sure I can answer all of your questions as well as I'd like to be able to. So it's one of those areas I recognise. You see, the difficulty is this: in principle, the union of the sort that I would want, you would have a fair union-wide funding formula, which included, in my view, guaranteed levels of funding for, whether you have regional governments, not the point, but for regions of England, which you don't have at the moment. So at the moment, you have guaranteed support at a certain level for Scotland coming from Barnett. You have no guarantees for English regions, and in the periods of austerity, the poorer English regions lost out disproportionately within the English budget. So that's where, if you like, my vision would be. That is an immensely difficult thing to do early on, not least because if you did it on day one, you would almost certainly cut Scottish funding fairly quickly. And I can't imagine anything worse for the maintenance of the union than bringing forward proposals for a union based on cutting the Scottish budget. So in other words, this is that sort of reform, which in principle is ideal, is impossible unless you have a system of much greater trust between the nations and the union itself. So what you might need to do is find a way of saying, can we address some of the more egregious flaws of Barnett, which particularly relate to the funding of Wales, and on a needs basis to the poorest English regions? Can you do a political deal in which there's no sense in Scotland of losing out, but can actually address some of these issues? My guess is that, well, given how long Barnett's been around, changing the Barnett formula is not the work of a committee set up for a few months to come up with something different. It's a change in politics as well as fiscal arrangements. But yes, ultimately, I would like to see a fair funding formula across the union, which for the foreseeable future means that England will fund the union. And one of the things that is there to keep the union together is that it will be the surplus of taxes generated out of southeast of England and London that enables the union to exist financially. So that is part of what England brings to the table.
Okay, I think before I bring in Professor Kenny, in the interest of time, I'm going to call Baroness Fuchs, because I think she wanted to pursue some of these other aspects of this same area.
Yes, indeed. I wanted to look more closely at devolution in the shape of metro mayors, combined authorities, which is the nearest, I suppose, we get to English devolution. Do you have views on how successful that has been and whether we are able to take that further in the incremental steps suggested by Professor Denham?
Professor Kenny, do you want to come in there?
Yes, let me answer that one briefly, and then I'll just say something about money as well. I think it's very important that we actually do ask that question and attempt to evaluate how that particular innovation has gone. Partly, I mean, it's, metro mayors have been around now for a few years, and when they were first introduced, one of the skeptical arguments about them, one of the counter arguments was that, that they really, because of the sort of geographical level at which they sat, they would never become popular institutions. People just wouldn't relate to them and wouldn't understand, why they had this extra layer of politicians. Well, actually, it seems to me that on that metric, things have gone fairly well. If you look at measures like voter turnout at elections, that has gradually started to go up. I think for many people, in all honesty, because there's fairly low level of understanding of those institutions, which is partly because they're new, I suspect that the very public dispute between some of the city regional mayors and the government in the course of, I think it was October last year, over the handling of regional approaches to regional policy in relation to lockdowns, I think that has probably made those mayors much more salient, much more familiar to people. But at the level of governance, of how well have they done, of course, it's a mixed story, because there are different mayors in power, different political parties. Overall, I mean, we at the institute I run have tried to do an evaluation of their performance. They've actually been remarkably successful within the tight constraints, or the constraints posed by having fairly limited powers. and limited budgets within which they operate. But I think there are some very interesting policy successes there. And I think also what we found is that those mayoral figures have a lot of what's called soft power, that they are able to convene people within their area and able to promote that region. I mean, Andy Street does this in West Midlands, Steve Rotherham in Liverpool, very successfully externally as well. So I think some of the worst fears about those institutions have not come to pass. Your question about whether the government might want to build out from the model it's currently got is an absolutely key one, because at the moment, this system is not even half built. I think 37% of the English population has one of these mayors. The rest don't and have no equivalent system of governance other than their local council. Now that is part of, I think, of the confusion of English governance, which Professor Denham referenced earlier. There is a huge opportunity to build out from that model. It's a very complicated thing to do, and it depends in part on what the government wants devolution to be for. And you will notice, as I have, that the white paper on devolution has now been replaced by a white paper on levelling up. So it looks as if devolution has been rather subsumed beneath the levelling up purpose. But I think it's a critical question because I think it's not clear that we can deliver all the goals, the ambitious policy goals of levelling up, without having those equivalent figures in other parts of England.
Professor Denham, do you want to add?
Well, let me just add to that by saying that the next stage has got to be the devolution of real power. And if I might just go back, because it's topical today, the Marmot report on health inequalities in Greater Manchester. In most European nations that are less centralised than we are, many of the issues it raises, from education to housing to economic development to health provision itself, lie far more within the control of some sort of institution operating at the level of something like Greater Manchester. Our relationships at the moment are entirely based on whether central government will agree with somebody that they should be allowed a certain amount of autonomy over these things for a limited period of time. The next stage has got to be for English devolution to be much more something that areas can draw down as of right, as they develop the institutional structures to deliver, not something as we have at the moment that can be taken away. And the levelling up agenda so far has taken monies that used to be spent locally and is now making them Whitehall funds that are dispersed by Whitehall ministers. So that, we were in a position, I would say, a year ago, where there was a story about England that lots of people bought into, which was of powerful city regions with clear leadership, working with universities and business on a localised industrial strategy supported by central government. And there were lots of people across the political spectrum, all the different degrees of scepticism, bought into that. That story seems to be disappearing from the government's narrative now. So I fear that rather than building on what's been done, we're going backwards just at the moment.
Baroness Hooks, did you want to come back there?
Yes, just briefly. I assume from what you've said that proper funding is going to be key to any extension of the system.
It is, and it's primarily about devolving funding that Whitehall likes to hang on to for itself. Whitehall still generally thinks that probably a minister in the Department of Health and a health service official can work out how to tackle health inequalities in Manchester. And those of us who've been ministers have had the illusion of sitting behind a desk, pulling on levers that are attached to nothing whatsoever and pretending we're changing things in Cornwall and Cumbria. And we've just got to change our culture at the centre.
Lord Hennessy, come to you finally.
Thank you. It's been fascinating listening to you both today, because you've laid out beautifully, I think, though slightly depressingly, the problem, which I think is how to reconcile multiple asymmetries between the four nations, between central, local, between the patchwork quilt we have of local government and so on. And you've offered us a whole range of possibilities to doing things. One is an oil can to the status quo. One is incrementalism, which is the way reform normally happens. One is an element of design, which we have an aversion to in this country. And the other one is a big bang. I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of what General de Gaulle said in a moment of despair about France. It's impossible to govern a country that produces 235 different cheeses. And what you've outlined is the de Gaulle problem in the British context. But what do we do next? Constitutional convention? Where do we start? If I could give you one reform each, where would it be and how soon would you do it and where?
I think Professor Denham will come to you first and give Professor Kenny just a little moment to think.
Well, if it was one of my steps first, it would be the step of saying within Whitehall, within Westminster, within the cabinet, we delineate England from the rest of the Union. Lots would then follow from that. But the bigger problem of the cheese, if you like, is can we change our political culture? Because the problem of asymmetry is not the asymmetry. It's a politics, and I was part of this in my political career, that says that when you've won an election, you've won. And when you've won an election, you get to decide. And you can't manage a state like that, where lots of people are winning different elections, and each of whom have got autonomy and legitimacy. And the bigger challenge, to be honest, is changing a political culture that actually says the best politicians are the people who can manage those relationships.